This is now what? Life after redundancy. When your job disappears, but you don't. Hello. I'm Stevie, and you're joining me on my journey through and hopefully past redundancy, where I'm regularly asking myself the question, now what? And if you're listening to this while also melting into your sofa because it's absolutely not the weather to be doing anything that requires a shirt with a collar or a tie, let alone sitting in a room with a panel of strangers trying to remember what your biggest achievement was, I see you, I really do. The phrase warm handshake on arrival has never felt more like a threat. This show exists for the bit that nobody puts on a timeline. Not the redundancy itself, there's plenty of written about that. Not a new job, everyone wants to talk about that bit. But it's the bit in the middle. The part where you're functional and capable, but maybe also slightly unraveling in ways that are tricky to explain to folk who haven't been there. Each episode is part practical, part perspective, and part... Look, I'm not going to stand here and tell you to believe in yourself, because if that worked, you wouldn't need a podcast. What I will say is that most episodes leave you with something useful, something that makes the next conversation or the next application or the next 2 in the morning feel slightly less like a problem you've invented specifically to suffer through. Today, though, I want to start with a question, and that question is, have you ever known every word to a song? I mean, really known them, sung them at full volume with conviction, possibly while indicating at a roundabout, and then someone hands you a microphone and suddenly you can't remember how it actually starts? Because that's exactly the problem we're talking about today. Not karaoke specifically, though we're going to come back to that, but the gap between knowing your stuff and being able to perform your stuff on demand in a room while someone looks at you. It's one of the most underrated challenges of the redundancy journey, and it's the one I wanted to tackle today. And here's the thing, a lot of roles for a lot of people, the work spoke for itself. You did the job got done, people saw the results, and the extent to which you had to actively sell yourself was manageable, limited, maybe annual review time. Then redundancy happens and suddenly you're finding yourself in rooms, interview panels, networking events, video calls with recruiters where you have to present yourself, not your past results on a slide, not your team's output, your value, your story, your reasons for being the right person for the thing, delivered out loud in real time to people you've never met, on topics where you might feel like an enthusiastic amateur rather than a seasoned expert that you actually are. And that's a specific kind of pressure that most people aren't prepared for. And it's not because you don't necessarily know your stuff, but because knowing your stuff and being able to articulate your stuff clearly, memorably, without your brain quietly filling everything under unavailable, those things are different skills. Which is exactly why I wanted to get today's guest on the show. Dave James is a twice TEDx speaker and speaker coach who works with individuals, leaders, and businesses to help them communicate with confidence and authenticity. And before you clock out on the word authenticity, stay with me, because Dave uses it to mean something genuinely specific and useful rather than just the LinkedIn buzzy buzzwords. His background isn't what you expect. He spent years in healthcare, and what he's took from all of that was this: the ability to build rapport fast with people who are scared and don't know what's coming next. Which, if you think about it, is exactly the skill that redundancy calls on you to demonstrate in rooms where you've never had to demonstrate it before. His framework is called Speaking Without Freaking, and yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, and yes, it's exactly what we need. But before we get into it though, if you find this show useful at any point, the best thing you can do is follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It costs you 0 and takes about 4 seconds. It means this show finds more people who are navigating this weird in-between bit, wondering what happens next. And if you have a spare moment and the inclination, a review is even better. It genuinely helps. And if you're looking for somewhere to land between episodes, somewhere that isn't a recruitment site or a wellness page telling you to journal your feelings, come and find The Invisible Queue at theinvisiblequeue.co.uk. It's a community built for people navigating exactly this. Free to join, no motivational posters. And if you'd like to reach out to the show, suggest themes for an episode or connect with me, you can do so at thenowwhat.co.uk. But enough of all that, let's get into it. So my guest today has had one of those career paths that make complete sense in retrospect, but probably very little at the time. Dave James spent years working in healthcare as a nurse in A&E and then a podiatrist, which, in case you're wondering, is the person who deals with your feet. He ran his own clinical podiatry practice, co-founded a foot health charity, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, accumulated something that turned out to be more transferable than a specialism in toenails. The ability to walk into a room with someone who is frightened and under pressure and make them feel quickly that they're in safe hands. Dave works with individuals, leaders and businesses, and increasingly with people who are in exactly the same kind of career transition that this show exists for. So, here's my conversation with Dave. Hello, Dave. Fantastic to speak with you today. Just before we get into everything, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and roughly how long you've been doing it?
That's a really good question. So I am a speaker coach. I am a 2 times TEDx speaker, which is either really impressive or not, depending on whether you know what TEDx is. And I essentially work with businesses and individuals and leaders in order to help them to be able to speak more and do it confidently and authentically and all of those other buzzwords. But probably the biggest thing is to stop them from actually having a little accident in their undergarments or crapping their pants, I think, as I put it on LinkedIn. And I've been doing this work now for about 3 years, which has been really enjoyable and really interesting.
That's great. And before we get into the work itself, as far as I understand, the route that you've taken to get here hasn't been an obvious one. So you worked in healthcare, clinical practice, so you're a charity co-founder and then speaker coaching. So what kind of things have you taken from your past lives that have actually taught you something valuable about connecting with someone in the moment?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think one of the things it took me a long while to learn is everything I've done in the past has a connection to now. And it's always really easy to look back over your life and go, I can see the connections and where the dots join. In the moment, you can't see it. And when I was working out how I approach coaching people to speak, whether it's coaching established speakers or whether it's people who've never stepped on a stage or spoken before, I looked at what in my past led me to be able to do that. As somebody who is, identifies as an introvert and is neurodivergent, on paper, it's not something which I should be able to do, but I can do it. And I realized one of the biggest things was communicating with patients. So when you're in A&E and you've got 4 hours to introduce yourself to a patient, to see them, assess them, to treat them and then discharge them, you have to create rapport very quickly. And that translates beautifully into being a speaker or being on stage. Is you have to connect with your audience quickly, and you have to know when you're not connected with your audience so that you can change that direction. And everything I've done in healthcare, from running my own practice, from working with the homeless with the charity Forgotten Feet, to lecturing and doing a master's degree and all of the other things in between, and even then going out to market your business and network, all stems from that connection work and leads very clearly into what I do now.
I think, as you say, it's that piece of, it's great in hindsight to look back and see where those skills have grown from. But I can imagine in the moment in time, you weren't necessarily thinking, you know what, this right now is going to be the thing that in the future is going to set me up really nicely.
Yeah, 2 o'clock in the morning in the John Radcliffe A&E when I'm, it's well, I was going to say dead quiet, because it was never dead quiet. You don't sit there and go, I think one day I shall be a speaker coach and I shall take these experiences of pulling bits of vacuum cleaner out of someone's anatomical holes and I shall turn it into a keynote speech. Although I do talk about that stuff, but you don't. I think for me as well, there's definitely been not really been a plan. So everything I've done has been, oh, that looks interesting, let me have a go at that. And so everything is it's fallen onto something else and fallen onto something else and just followed my nose a little bit. But yeah, there was no plan in A&E I'm going to do this when I'm older.
Fantastic. And if I ever had the opportunity to land any presentation or meeting and start with the story about someone getting parts of a vacuum cleaner stuck somewhere that it shouldn't be, I'd lead with that every time. I'd find scenarios where it could fit.
Absolutely. And partly speaking is about being memorable, hopefully for the right reason. And I can still clearly think of a couple of times where I've been networking and I've used my 60-second pitch, and I've done things in a way where I had one person come back to me 7 years later and say, I'll never forget that 60-second pitch. It's cemented in their mind. So any stories you can tell which connect you with other people are really good. And we connect over the stuff which isn't great, or maybe has someone who is not in the best position. And I realize saying the best position probably isn't the right way to describe it in this context. But yeah, we connect on all kinds of things. We connect on very human stuff.
Brilliant. When I was reading some of the work that you've done, you talk about most people speaking from their expertise, and your thing is helping them speak from who they are instead. And that sounded to me like quite a meaningful distinction. So when did you first notice a difference, and what made it click for you?
And it's really interesting because I've worked over the years with a number of people in academia and healthcare. And people in academia and healthcare, and I don't think it's just limited to academia and healthcare, they are people with huge brains who have a lot of knowledge about a subject. And the higher you go up in terms of education, the more you know about a narrower field of expertise. And when you deliver that in a speech to an audience, you think they have the same level of knowledge as you, or you believe you've got to give them your entire amount of knowledge in 15 minutes. And what tends to be missing from it is them as an individual. I'm always interested in why people choose to do things. Why would anyone choose to do a PhD maybe on toenail fungus, for example, going back to my podiatry world? But there are people who get really excited by that, and that's their level of expertise. And when I first started speaking, and certainly when I first started doing pitches and doing 60 seconds at networking events, it was always about the features rather than the benefits. And then, as soon as I started to bring in a little bit of my personality and a little bit of me into it and started to tell my story, it connected with people in a very different way. And I think people are scared of doing that. People are scared of, well, if I tell them something and they don't like me, well, that's okay. If they don't like you, they're going to find out at some point that you're not the person for them. But there's something more powerful about that when you bring the idea of who you are, and you bring the idea of your expertise, or I suppose content, and you think about the audience and how you're communicating it to them, you get this really powerful way of delivering. But it only works when you bring you into it. And if we think about classical rhetoric with pathos, logos, and ethos. So we're looking at pathos being emotion, logos being logic, ethos being credibility, is that a lot of people will lead with credibility. You see all these people on LinkedIn and other social media platforms saying, well, I've worked for this organization, and I've got this organization, a 1,000,000% of improvement in 5 minutes. And we're talking about results and credibility. But what I don't see with those people sometimes is the story about them, or maybe that story about when they didn't succeed, because the reality for many of us is that we don't succeed at things. So bringing in that you bit makes things, in my opinion, much more interesting. But it also means you've got to look at yourself. You've got to really identify what it is that drives you, what's important to you, and then bring that in connection to the audience. And I do believe that serves the audience far better than just, here are 15 minutes worth of statistics on how to cure an ingrowing toenail. I'd rather hear someone turn around and say,
I'd love to hear.
Oh, I mean, but people
actually,
talk about.
No, you might know the answers to that.
Well, if this was a video version, I'd be showing you pictures now, but I won't. But we can talk about. I'm picking on ingrown toenails because part of my past was being the nail surgery lead for a local NHS trust. I used to take people's toenails off many times a week, and it was so much fun. But we can talk about the expertise stuff. But when I talk to people about what my experience of having nail surgery was like, and that's when I had my own nail surgery done, it changed how I communicated with my patients, because instead of saying you're going to definitely have these things happen, it was like, this is what we talk about to patients mostly, but my experience was this. And so you get to share a very different dimension.
That's really good. And I think you've kind of touched on an answer to this already, but just to kind of explore it a bit more, when you've supported people with finding their presentation style or their approach to public speaking, what kind of misconceptions do you see them having and when they start their journeys?
Well, one of the biggest ones is that people believe you have to have confidence before you go and speak. And that's the thing which people look for. And in fact, as we recording this today, one of my posts on LinkedIn was talking about the average improvement of a confidence score over my last 4 clients has been 76% improvement. I don't know what that means. What I do know is that that the work we've done together has given them an opportunity to do things which they perhaps didn't do before. And people will come looking for confidence. I want to be confident so I can speak. Well, I give people a little bit of permission. I help them to go out and do it, and then realize it wasn't about confidence. A lot of it is about permission. So that's a really big misconception. And I suppose one of the other things is that you've always got to speak in one particular way. So we see these people on stage who hold their hands in particular positions, they move in a particular way, and we believe that's the only way to speak. And one of my goals over the last few years and even now and to the future is how many different styles of speaking can I have a go at? Whether it's comedy, whether it's improv, whether it is formal speaking, whether it's hosting and presenting, whether it's Pecha Kucha at 6 minutes and 40 seconds. You don't have to be trapped in any one speaking style. And I believe that people will look at videos of people, or they'll see people speak on stage and go, oh, that's the way in which you have to speak. And it's not. There are so many different ways to do it. So for me, it's that confidence myth, and it's the view that speaking only has one shape, and it doesn't.
That's really, really interesting. And it leads me neatly into thinking quite specifically about redundancy. So, the scenarios that folk navigating the redundancy journey encountering is that they aren't just learning to speak under pressure, because they're doing it when their self-confidence could be quite dented. Their identity is a bit wobbly, and the stakes in terms of getting cut through on interviews and on interactions just feel so much bigger. So someone on this journey may have had their professional identity shaken, but they could be brilliant at what they do. And the moment they sit on an interview or get on a video call, they just freeze, or they over-explain, or, you were saying before, they try and really amp up their credibility, which just lends to a mess of a conversation. So from your experience, what kind of things are really happening there, and why is pressure producing those types of behaviors?
Yeah, it's really interesting. One thing I would say is that I have never been made redundant. Well, I've never been made redundant by somebody else, but I've certainly made myself redundant on a couple of occasions. And I suspect that you mentioned identity, and identity becomes a huge part of this. And my background in healthcare, when I worked as a podiatrist and I had jobs on the NHS, I never failed an interview. So I had a couple of interviews and never failed, or never got someone turn around and go, no, not today. The first time I ever didn't get a job was a teaching job. And I was okay with that because I already ran my own practice. So they were looking for someone very specific. And actually what they did is they came back later on and said, will you come and do a different type of teaching from us? Because actually we did want you for that. So it was a really interesting thing. But when I have left roles where I've had a very strong identity, and I was telling this story to a client yesterday who is a podiatrist, about my number plate. I had a number plate on my car as a podiatry student, which had the letters TOE on the end, toe. I hadn't noticed it. Another podiatrist noticed it, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I kept that number plate for a number of cars, because for me, my identity was podiatry. And then suddenly I had this moment when I started to get coached, where I threw my dollies out of the pram. I went, no, I'm not. My identity is me. And podiatry is just one of the things I do. Now, we're not going to get into a discussion about whether there is such a thing as the self. If we want to go down the Buddhist route, there is no self, and then we're stuffed. But it became this really big identity shift. And I know when I left the NHS and went into private practice, that was really weird, because it was I was grieving something. I was grieving that loss of a career, because I was on a very particular trajectory towards a leadership role. And now I look back now, I can see exactly why I didn't go down that route. Change in the NHS, it didn't match my values. I was able to step away from it. But it was really interesting that my whole identity was an NHS podiatrist. And then I'm a private podiatrist running my own clinic. But I'm not a podiatrist on my own. I'm also a business owner, and probably 20% of my identity should have been podiatry, but it was more than that. And so you do grieve that change. There's definitely a fear of losing that identity. It's a safety net. So I've made myself redundant at many points, but that identity shift and that fear of the unknown, and for me, there was a big part of not trusting myself. And I can see this in every venture I've done since, the business and marketing coaching for healthcare professionals. I had to start from where I thought was scratch again. As a podiatrist, I knew what I was doing. I got my clinical practice. I got a master's degree. As a coach, I had no track record. So I had to build that track record by getting your first client and second client and getting paid and all of those things. And then when I went more down the personal coaching route, it's like, I feel like I'm starting again. And then the whole identity piece comes up. And then with the speaker coaching, it feels like I'm starting again. And I can definitely see when, coming back to the speaking we talked about before, I can definitely see when I understood me more and I knew my stuff, my expertise, and I brought those two things together. That was when I felt that I had the confidence to do it. And that was when my identity shifted a lot again. And you look back and realize that you haven't started again. You've maybe dropped down a few steps on the mountain, but actually you haven't gone all the way down. You're building upon something before. And I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd had that ability to see that everything I'd done was a great foundation for where I was going, not me shifting to a totally different career and thinking I got to start again. Because then I wouldn't have tried so hard to prove myself. I would have given myself a bit of space and a bit of self-love, as the personal lifey coachy type person in me would talk about.
Good.
But the identity shift is hard. And not just the identity shift internally, but the identity shift of what other people see of you. So I still now, and weirdly today, I have actually bumped into a couple of my old patients from 7 or 8 years ago. And I used to treat the woman's mom, and she still hasn't forgiven me in 8 years for selling my podiatry practice. But it's the identity that people place upon you as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just thinking about that representation of self and the context I'm thinking of a lot, again, folk on this redundancy journey, they are thinking a lot of the time about how to present their best self and how to convey their experience, their authenticity during interviews and in interactions with people that they wouldn't have necessarily had conversation with before. And there is a version of interview preparation that is essentially about memorizing answers. So it's all about, rehearsing your competencies, you polish your examples, telling your story, you hit your keywords. And I've done the whole rigid preparation thing. And then I've sat in an interview feeling like I'm just reciting a Word documentation written about a fictional version of me. And in that scenario and in that instance, I know that for a fact it didn't land. But what kind of things do you see with that type of approach and that type of preparation when it comes to, conveying your worth and explaining your value?
I think to begin, you have to understand your learning style. And I know all the visual, auditory, kinesthetic stuff has been debunked, but I still find that quite useful as a reference point. And memorization can be quite hard. And it's like cramming for an exam and then realizing that actually the stuff you'd crammed for isn't on the exam anyway, and you put all that effort into it. I would say it's going back to, again, knowing your stuff, knowing your stuff, and knowing yourself inside and out. And if you haven't done the exercises around your values and your character and even gone down the route of therapy is really useful to understand who you are. Once you've got that piece, you know how you're going to work in stressful situations. Then when it comes to the expertise stuff, instead of thinking about, I need to have the answer specifically for that particular scenario, think about how you apply a problem-solving approach to any scenario. And thinking about my last interviews as ever as a podiatrist was questions around how would you deal with a particular situation. And quite often it would always be, well, I would go back to the policies and procedures of the organization. So you've got this approach to say, what is it that they want to hear from me? But what would I do slightly differently, or what would I do which which maybe not that they're not expecting, but would make them go, this person's different. And there's a lot of self-trust as well. If you are genuinely good at your job and you are genuinely good with your expertise, you will have a problem-solving approach. Going back and understanding what that problem-solving approach is, and then in that moment applying it. And what I would also say is that it's about being able to control the interview as well. There's definitely a difference in status, and there's definitely a powerful kind of balance going on there. And being able to very clearly just articulate your needs. Well, actually, can you rephrase that question for me? Can you put it into context for me? It shifts the pressure on other people to reframe it in a way which you understand. And then that gives you thinking time, and then you can answer it differently. And it's all those little interview preps. But I would always caution against memorizing things exactly. Because if something happens which you're not expecting, and the same with speaking, when people memorize a speech, and every word leads into the next word, then 17 minutes later we're all asleep. What if something happens in that room? What if an audience member heckles? What if the alarm goes off? What if you suddenly remember that you've left the oven on at home? All of these things are going to hijack you. If you've memorized it, you're not expecting it will throw you. If you've embodied it and you've spent time with that content and you've spent time with it in different ways, it becomes so much easier to work on it and be present in the moment.
You've just given me a real triggering flashback there. And it unfortunately is not from my recent interviews or recent experiences, but I think in my mid-20s, I was going for an interview for some very low level role. And I was doing my interview prep. And I remember thinking, I know that one of the questions that folk ask is, what are your weaknesses? So I thought I was really clever, and I know this is a stupid answer, but I thought it was really clever at the time to go perfectionism. That's a really good weakness to have, and because then that shows that you're really clever and stuff. But when it came to the interview itself, they framed the question as, what would you like to develop in yourself more? And what did I say? Perfectionism. And I remember I didn't get that job. And I remember coming out of it kind of going, why did I say that? And it was, as you say, that overthinking of, I wasn't in that moment, I was not prepared for a kind of slight change of angle and a slight change of approach to actually handle the reality of what was going on.
Yeah. And it's understanding as well that those people who are on an interview panel may well be interviewing 10, 20 people in a day. It's a lot of hard work for them. And what they're looking for is that spark, that personality. And most people, many people will interview well. They look great on paper, they'll interview well, but in the moment, it's how they respond in the moment. That thing about perfectionism, I love that. And I think if somebody said to me, what's one of your weaknesses? I would say one of my big weaknesses is not being able to identify my weaknesses, and just do a little bit meta with it. But it's those questions which become almost like cliched. And I wonder whether there's a whole flip we need to do in the interview system, which is where instead of somebody being interviewed for a job or a role, is that they get to interview their employers or potential employers. And say, well, why is it that you've accepted me to come in here? What was it about my CV which looked good to you that you brought me in for this interview? And when people say, do you have any questions for us? It's like, I've always got questions for you. Always got questions for you. And it's fun when you do those things, but it's confidence. And I'm sure in my junior roles, I turned up and went through the motions. And nursing when I was moving into A&E 20 plus years ago, there were nursing jobs everywhere. So they could interview 20 people and probably give 10 jobs to people. So there was no shortage of jobs. Now it's a very different. I hate to use the term competitive landscape, but it is. You've got to show your worth in other ways. And this is where the skills which almost can't be measured on paper become something which is really important to develop. It's the interpersonal stuff. It's what they call the soft skills, which are not soft at all. It's how you struggle under pressure. And then we add into the mix neurodivergence and where that is at the moment. And then we start adding in all the other things which are going on around diversity. And it gets quite fascinating and also scary. And I don't think interview techniques and interview panels have probably caught up with that yet.
Definitely. So just changing angle slightly, we connected when I saw some content you posted on LinkedIn. and I saw that you were running a workshop, and the title of which really made me smile. It's called Speaking Without Freaking. I think it's a great name because it really describes the experience rather than kind of an aspirational goal. And I definitely recall moments of my professional past where I speaked and freaked or spoken froke. And I guess kind of from your perspective, what are the kind of earliest warning signs in someone's voice or posture or energy that they're on the freaking category rather than speaking? And what kind of things should they do first?
They normally tell you. If they're nervous, they normally tell you. What's the phrase? It's and this is not designed to offend anybody who chooses not to eat meat or eggs. Is that it's the joke that how do you know someone's a vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you. How do you know someone's neurodivergent? Don't worry, they'll tell you. And I am very guilty of bringing that into every conversation, including today. And I promised myself I never would. People will generally tell you. And what I find is a really good step is that you acknowledge that and go, cool, tell me more about it. And my belief and in my experience, there are normally a number of things that will freak people out. One is that they don't know the environment they're going to be speaking in. The second is they don't know what it is they're speaking about. They don't understand their content, their approach, and their stories. And the third is that there's probably something in the past which needs therapy because there is some traumatic experience. Or maybe they were told at school that they talk too much, or they had a big mouth, or whatever it was. And so since then they've internalized it and been quiet. One of the things I like to do with people is I like to get them speaking in a different way. So we do on the workshop, we do dice games, get everyone up and we roll dice. And, I've got I could show them on the screen, but for the audio listeners, they won't be able to see them. But they are 9 cubes, which you roll like dice and you tell a story based on those. And what you do is you start to introduce people to the idea that there's no such thing as perfection in speaking. And it's okay. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay that you don't have a story which kind of comes together nicely. And I start to get people using that muscle of speaking. It's that one step. And you can break it down into all of these little granular parts. Go and speak on a keynote stage. No, I'm not going to do that. It's too scary for me. Okay, what if you go and look at the stage? Oh, it's still too scary for me. Okay, what if I show you a picture of the stage? Oh, okay, that's all right. And if you break it down to thinking about the first steps I ever took, I get to stand on stages now, I get to do the work I do now, but that wasn't where it started. For me, it started with being 12 years old doing an English speaking board exam, which tells you everything you need to know about the 12-year-old version of me who was an absolute nerd, and I did it with a broken arm. Then there's the times where people have given me a microphone and I've had no choice but to use it. Being asked to be best man 5 times, all of these little things. But the intention for me was when I went networking and made myself stand up in front of a room and reviewed that and realized that I needed to work on it and improve, but also using video to market my business. Because suddenly I had to be visible, and the cost of invisibility is much greater than the cost of that worry and that fear of being seen and speaking with without freaking. And you start to do little things. And even I did a whole year of Facebook Lives in 2021, which was every day on my business page. I would go to the gym, I'd come back from the gym and I'd get the camera out and I'd talk to it. And I got so used to just speaking to the camera. And it's those incremental steps which make a difference. Acknowledging the fear at the beginning, because it's real for a lot of people, and we can't say, oh, it's not there, it'll go away. And then teaching people that it's okay to take that fear and those nerves, just not let them stop them from doing things.
And you've touched on this already today, and I saw from the workshop details, kind of you work a lot with personal stories, and as you said a little earlier, that can feel like a risk for someone navigating redundancy, considering the fact that their own recent stories may involve being let go, and they're navigating these feelings of uncertainty, and they're in professional limbo. How do you help someone find the useful, powerful version of their story rather than the version that makes them feel like a liability?
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, with that if you have been made redundant, it is such a shock. It's it's an insult on value, and it's an insult on identity, and you have to recover from that. It is a grieving period. You're going through a process of grief. And I think what's really interesting with the personal stories is, first of all, we have to find them. We have to find those stories first. And I do with clients, I do an exercise called the River of Life, which is a therapy exercise where you start off and the river is this long river where you start at birth and work through to where you are now, and you spend time working your way along that river. And you write down the things which have happened to you or for you or with you or around you, and those particular stories which stand out from childhood and teenage years and adulthood, whether it's personal or work. And you start to identify those stories. And you start to see that there are so many stories which we have in life which could be construed as negative. And there's a whole discussion here around whether something is good or bad. It's just the emotion we place upon it, which is easy to say and not so easy in the moment. But then you start to realize that nothing bad is going to happen when you tell those stories. And then the art is being able to tell those stories so that it connects with people, not disconnects. And I do see a lot of people early on in their speaking career who will sometimes treat the stage as therapy. But don't get me wrong, it's lovely to be paid to have therapy, but it's not good for your audience. And so you start to identify the stories and you start to reframe them in different ways. And one of the other things is that we live with our stories so much that we often think they're boring. And when we speak them out loud and we speak to different people, we realize that A, they're not boring, and B, other people have struggled with something similar. And I remember back in 2018, when I was a lot younger than I am now, I stood on stage for the first time and talked about anger. And I'd struggled with anger since my teenage years. And by that point, I was 3 years into really doing some personal development journey work on it. And every time I say personal development journey, I want to do air quotes because it just feels a bit cheesy. But I'd realized that then I was ready to speak about it. And it was very messy when I stood on stage and spoke about it. And I was scared that people would reject me because of it. And I promised to put it out there online. I promised to share the link. And then when I got the link, I was like, I promised to share this. I can't not share it. And I remember some of the conversations which came up afterwards, because my fear was people are going to say, well, we now know you're a bit of an angry twat. We don't want to talk to you. But people actually came to me and said, thank you, because that's been my experience, or that's been my partner's experience. And, is there something, what helped you? And it gave me that real invitation to start exploring things more, and ultimately led to the TEDx on mindfulness and men's mental health. Probably led to what I'm doing now and selling my podiatry practice and moving to other things. Every story has that ability to connect or disconnect. It's how you use it and how you frame it, but it's also the opportunities which come when you do share your story. And we are, ChatGPT would turn around and say, in the ever-changing landscape of, and that's the point we throw up on while you're listening to this podcast. But we are in a place at the moment where we need more connection. And we've been conditioned over the last 40 odd years to not be connected to people. The sharing of stories connects us. And just because your story from your perspective might look like it's not a great story, or you might be scared about what it means, you can guarantee that when you share it with other people, they'll be able to see themselves in that story, and they'll be able to share stories with you, which can also help. Because being alone is a terrible thing, but sharing the stories really helps to bridge that. And coming back to that point about how do you help people find their stories and tell the good ones, you encourage people to share their stories and see what gets reflected back. And it's fascinating when people see that that it's okay to share those stories. I love
That's
seeing the emotion which comes with it.
So thinking about some of the more practical elements of public speaking and presenting, to my understanding, body language and vocal technique are essentially the rock star divas of the presentation world. Where do those things sit in your approach? And is technique something that you layer on later? And is it, is it running in parallel from discovering your stories and discovering yourself kind of as part of the journey?
It comes later on. And many times when I see people start to develop their speaking, they start with technique. They start with how do I use the stage and how do I hold my hands and voice and posture and all of those things, which are great. I mean, look at things like Amy Cuddy's TEDx, which is all about power poses. It's all about using technique to kind of hack things a little bit. And technique, it does have a place. What I find is, and I use an approach called brain, page, stage. Brain is all about you. It's your stories, it's your character, it's your values, it's what's important to you. Page is how do we compile that? How do we put it together? How do we write a speech? How do we add the different flavors and seasonings to make it work? Stage is how we deliver it. And when you've got that beautiful space of knowing who you are, added into it being put into a story framework or a speech framework which has flexibility and works for you, technique sorts itself out. And then once you've got less technique to worry about, you can then start to work on the technique bits which matter. So you're always trying again. It's speaking is about connection rather than disconnection, and anything you do. I mean, me as a bald man with a beard, you as a bald man with a beard, we could step up on stage. We've both got very pale skin. We could, just by our looks, disconnect from an audience because that's how it is. Other audiences would love us and connect us. But you can do things
disconnected the audience on the podcast because they might go, bald guys with beards, forget this.
We thought you all had loving manes of hair you could run your fingers through.
Lustrous locks. Sorry, everyone.
Sorry to disappoint. We look like the statistically average people in the world, I'm afraid.
Yes.
But you start to play with all of those little bits of technique. So how you use your hands, for example, can bring an audience in or can disconnect them. And you can use different planes and some great body language work around that. How you use your voice, how you speed things up to make things really exciting, or you slow things down to bring people to this moment. How you pause. Or I do one of those awkward pauses and try and hold it for 10 seconds, which is never great on a podcast. And then how you use the stage. How do you make sure that you use your presence on the stage to include people? How do you move around the room? There's all of these things which can be useful techniques to support your message, but equally there are things which will disconnect. And even if I look at my speaking in the past, one of the things which comedians do is if they have pockets, they tend to put a hand in the pocket. They've got a very comedian style pose. That can be a sign of comfort, of I'm relaxed. This is cool. I'm in my element here. This is great. But to an audience member, it can look arrogant. And so you have to decide how much you are putting towards your audience because it's a status game again. So the technique can be tweaked and can be looked at. But I find if we work on that later, there's less technique to unravel because people are already present. They're already being there. And I'm going to use the term, and I hate saying it, authentic selves. And they know what it is they're talking about and they're familiar with the message. The technique sorts itself out a whole lot more because they're in the moment. Whereas if we start from a place of technique, it becomes much harder to unravel that technique later on.
That makes a lot of sense. And this may kind of link to that. It may be something different. But if there's someone listening to this and they've got an interview coming up or a networking event next week or so, is there one particular thing that you would highlight as being something they could actually do to prepare that would make a material difference?
I'd say practice or prepare would be a better way to do it. I've been to a networking event this morning and I have to say I quite enjoy networking events because I listen to other people do 60-second pitches and then I do one and they're like, how do I follow that? Because I've got a framework which I use. And one of my bugbears is when people start a pitch or a speech and they go, hi, I'm Dave. I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. Oh, you will look like a lovely audience. Because at that point, my brain's going, I don't care that you're pleased to be here today. I don't care that we're a lovely audience. What I care is, what are you going to do for me? And so I always like to start anything with something which isn't me, first of all. So this morning I was telling a story where I start off and say, imagine you come to this networking event today. You've met the person who's called AJ in this case. AJ gives you a sticker, you put it on your chest, you grab a drink, you wander around a bit. And then AJ says, Dave, we've got a problem here. The speaker for today can't make it. Can you go and do 10 minutes for us? And then I'll look at someone in the audience or look at someone in the group I'm in and say, what are you going to do? And they're either going to go, no, I don't do it, or yes, I can do it, or I'm not so sure about this. And then I go, well, I'm Dave. The work I do is to help you to be able to turn up at an event at short notice and do those things. So I start not by introducing me. I start with a scenario or a story which draws them in. And there's loads of ways you can talk. Questions, engagement, statistics, silence, noises, props. But do something which is different to everyone else. But for that, it requires preparation and practice. And certainly today, we were on 7 different tables and we moved around them this morning, which for some people, particularly if you've been made redundant, having to go back into that space sounds like hell on earth, particularly in the heat we've had recently. And my 60 seconds changed on every table. Sometimes, a little bit, sometimes a bit more drastically. But it's because I had a framework which I use and which I can prepare. And because that framework is always there, I can dump things into it at short notice and I can react to people around the table. So it's a preparation and practice for me and doing things a little bit differently.
That's really good. And there's a very powerful pitch as well. So I agree with that. Because as you were saying, I think about networking events I've been to and I'm just like, I don't think I'd want to do that. But that's exactly your point, isn't it? It's fantastic.
And networking is, particularly if we're thinking about, you've been made redundant, you're having to rebuild your identity and your value, and the chances are you're going to do something totally different. Or if you are going back into the world you were in before, you're probably going to want to do it differently because you're not going to want to feel that feeling of being made redundant again. So you're having to rebuild that identity. And one of the best ways to be seen, heard, and validated, particularly in business, particularly with AI, is to speak in front of an audience. And I would say any opportunity to do it. And when I work with my clients, particularly ones who I know locally and do networking stuff, my question is, which event are you speaking at next? I think, well, I don't know. And it's like, well, I'm going to go and talk to the person who organizes these events and I'm going to put your name forward. I'm going to throw you under the bus a little bit, but I'll be there to support you because it gives people a deadline to work towards. And it is getting out. It is the getting out of your comfort zone, or other cheesy phrases are also available. But it is doing things which push that comfort zone, to which stretch you a little bit and put you in places maybe you wouldn't be before, because that's where the opportunity comes. Get out there and do it.
That's great advice. Thank you. And I'd just like to talk a little bit more around kind of that identity of self and kind of the inner conversation and how it links to confidence, because I'm really aware that I think there's a conversation that we all have with ourselves, and I don't think it's restricted to people's employment status. When these conversations are happening, we don't always tend to be the kindest to ourselves. And for those navigating redundancy, that internal narrative can get pretty loud. How much of your work is actually about what someone says out loud versus what they're saying to themselves internally?
That's a really good question. And I would say that the intention of it is not so much to talk to that inner critic. I don't consider myself to be a mindset coach. That's not my thing. And even as a life coach, it's kind of, I'm going to build you up and tell you good things about yourself. For me, it's taking people into situations where they realize their worth, they realize their value, and they do things and go, oh, I've just done that. It's like the image just popped in my head is when I learned to ride a bike as a 6-year-old. It's that point where you know your dad's running alongside you, holding onto the saddle, and you think he's still there, and you turn around and he's half a mile down the road, and you're cycling. You're like, oh, now I can do this, and you've got this new reality that you move into, and confidence is a really interesting one around that. What I would always say to people is, even though my work's not directed at that, when you start to develop your speech and you start to look at your stories and you start to understand who you are, it starts to challenge a lot of that internal narrative. And it's working with the truth of things. So you've been made redundant. Yes, that's true. Was it because of something you did? It's unlikely, but you're going to feel that it is. You're going to go, well, I wouldn't have been made redundant had I done this, or had I talked to that person, or had I, done an extra 10 hours of work a week. And so we have all these little games we play in our head and little stories we tell ourselves. But when you start to distill it down to what's true versus what's not true. Am I terrible as an employee? No. You might feel not great at the moment, but you're not. Everything which has happened in redundancy was out of your control. And there'll be all well, I should have seen this coming and I should have planned for this. It's like, no, we never think that far ahead. We go into a job, we go into a career, we never think it's going to change. It's like marriage. You don't go into a marriage going, you know what, I reckon this has got 15 years and then I'm probably going to go off and look for a different person. We don't do that. We don't imagine a different world, so we don't necessarily prepare for it. And there's a great phrase by one of my mindfulness tutors, a monk up in Scotland called Choden, who has a phrase, it's not your fault the lightning struck the roof of your house, but it is your responsibility to fix it. And it touches on the fact that there's so many things going on which are outside of our control, and we can acknowledge those. We just don't take them on as our things to sort out. But what we do is we do have to sort out the consequences of it. You've been made redundant. that's a truth. You know, that job is no longer there. You're not going to go back to it. We can acknowledge that. The question is, what are you going to do now with it? Do you sit in that space of self-blame and say it's all my fault? Or do you go, okay, what's the smallest step I can take to move out of that? And with the speaking, you start to develop this use of language and speech and words and stories, and you start to see things as they truly are. And while you're expressing that outwards to the world via marketing and via speaking from stages or to audiences, it also bounces back into you. It comes back in that direction. It does. It's not unidirectionally. It travels in all directions, and sometimes you have to take a moment to notice that. And I'm saying that as somebody who has a very poor internal narrative. Maybe it's to do with my neurodivergence. Maybe it's because that's my imposter's always sat there. That even though I know I get great results with clients when I speak on stage and I'm really bloody good at what I do, there's still moments when my brain goes, yeah, but they're going to find out you this, Dave. They're going to find out that you don't have a coaching qualification, that what you did is you changed your name on LinkedIn to coach, and they're going to judge you on it, and you haven't got an ICF level 5 or level 7 qualification. And yes, you might have a certificate which is for funniest speaker in the speaker training you did in 2018, which was well deserved because you are hilarious. It's still not a proper qualification. And so there's all these little internal voices going on in my head and going, oh, and so you have to work with that. And when I first spoke about anger, I wasn't going to speak about anger 2 weeks out. I was going to speak about the chimp paradox by Dr. Stephen Peters. And I don't have any around me now, but I've got chimps on my shelving unit, which you obviously can't see on this audio podcast behind me. I have one on my key ring, and he's called Colin. And Colin represents my fear center, my amygdala. And when he makes a noise, instead of trying to cut him off, I have a conversation with him and go, you're trying to show me something. What is it? And I'll listen to you, but you've also got to let me show you what I can see. And Colin's really good. And he suddenly realized that big thing you're scared of isn't such a big thing. He's just reacting to something which happened in the past. And you have those conversations around it. But everything you do outwardly in developing your speech and your speaking, it reflects back. It always comes back.
It's really, really powerful. And yeah, you made a point about the redundancy journey and the feeling of it's my fault and it's kind of I should have done more, and as you were talking, it reminded me that, again, one of the reasons this podcast was set up in the first place was I needed to verbalize what was going on. But as it's gone on, I've seen folk who are navigating the same journey and myself get so much more empowered by speaking openly about it and having those story conversations. And it helps us avoid the 3 horsemen of regret, shoulda, woulda, and coulda, because they are the worst. And you can look back and kind of try and point to your career experiences and say, well, you know what, if I'd have donated bone marrow to the CEO's daughter, maybe I'd still have a job. It's a thing that happened, as you very rightly said. It's a thing that happened to you, and it's then your responsibility to go on and do the next thing. And it's a really powerful story there.
It's also acknowledging that it's very easy to talk about this stuff, but when you're in the middle of it, it's really hard. It's really hard. And a great friend of mine, Peter, who's a speaker, because he's called Peter the Speaker, weirdly. He's very Ron Seal. He does what he says on the tin. He talks about this idea that people, when they share their stories of struggle and failure, they never share them from a place of struggle and failure. They only share them from a place of resolution and success. And so wherever you are at the moment, if you're listening to this and you've been made redundant or there's something going on for you, it's not going to be the same in X number of weeks, days, months, years. But I also acknowledge that in the moment, you can't see past that. And it is literally the tiniest steps to make a difference. Like you're doing this podcast. Doing a podcast is hard because you've got to record it and listen to your voice. And yes, we can do it with all these different, very simple and available tools. Like we're on Teams at the moment. You can do it on Zoom and Riverside. There's so many ways you can do it. But to take that first step of going, I'm going to do a podcast, and then who's my first guest and what am I going to ask them? And then like you did to me, where you reached out on LinkedIn and said, I've got a podcast. Do you want to have a chat about it? It's a big thing to do that. But when you look back, you realize that those steps are essential to move from one place to another. But it's totally acknowledging that in the moment, bugger me, it's hard. It's very hard.
Definitely. I wanted to pick up another thing, and you touched upon it a couple of times, but I clocked in one of your client testimonials that mentioned something about they had that perception that their own neurodivergence was something that they had to overcome, and you helped them frame it in a way into making it something that made them more memorable, and it's reframing it rather than trying to fix it. Is that a pattern you see more broadly? So people treating their actual characteristics as problems to hide rather than things to build on?
Yeah, and certainly in neurodivergence. And what was interesting, and obviously talking about neurodivergence, because I swore I never would talk about it openly, and here I am every conversation. Even it's like you go to Asda and you talk to the machine and tell it about your neurodivergent. I had a lot of clients coming to me who were women and neurodivergent. That seemed to be quite a lot of the clients I worked with, and I didn't understand it until I got a diagnosis and went, oh, that's it. I mean, I'm yet to find out if I'm a woman, but there's still time. But it was really interesting that the conversations I was having was about people saying, well, I can't talk about that, and I can't do that. And if I go into a speaking situation, the expectation is that I get to do this. And I challenged it and said, what if you were to do that? One client I work with who's immense, she wanted to go and speak on stage barefoot. I was like, okay, go do it. What's the problem? Okay, we've got to think about the health and safety stuff, and it may be that you have to talk to the organizer and say, I work better barefoot. Can you tell me if there's any hazards from a health and safety perspective? But why not? Because in stepping onto that stage quite literally barefoot, what you're signaling to people is, this is me choosing to make this environment mine, and I invite you to do the same. And the testimony you're talking about there's a reason it's on currently at this moment on my banner, is it's one of my favorite ones. Because what I've seen from that person now is I've seen how they've gone to do more things. They've set up networking groups. They're very visible they've done their own podcasts. They're very visible on social media. They're not hiding behind this thing. It is something which they can use. And actually the strengths around autism and ADHD in that case are things which are, they're benefits. They are benefits. And I'm not going to say that they're superpowers, because if you're neurodivergent, trying to pick chocolate in Asda at 8:45, 15 minutes before closing, and you're weighing up the difference between 100 grams of this and 100 grams of that, and you can't decide, then you have a meltdown, then they have to escort you out and take you home. That's not a superpower. But that ability to see the world differently from a neurodivergent perspective is amazing. And when you give people the permission just to do that, when you give people the permission to go, you like Lego? Cool. Why don't you come on stage and do it with Lego? Why don't you create your whole keynote using Lego? I had one client who worked for a big organization, and he was really losing himself in it. This is before I was doing more of the speaker coaching, and he loves cars. I said, so why don't you get your suit and have the inside of your suit with your favorite car design on it? Because not only does it mean that you can hide it a little bit, it's not front and center, but it's always there for you, and then people will notice it, and it starts up a conversation. And it is that permission. It's that, well, I think you can do that. I think you're allowed to talk about that. In fact, I know you're allowed to talk about that. How about I set up an environment where you can do that, and you can realize that it's okay, and also realize that if other people don't like it, they can jog on in the nicest way of putting it. And when I see people who start to really talk about the things which are important to them and talk about them openly, they don't have to mask, they don't have to hide, they don't have to suppress these things because they're scared of what other people think. Suddenly they find people who believe the same thing or love what they're doing, and that noise is much louder than the people who go, oh, I don't like that. It just becomes a real, again, it's a real shift in identity, and it's a beautiful thing to watch, and it gives me permission to do more of that stuff as well. And I also believe that comes with experience. That comes with being happy with what you know as an expert, and it is correlated with the amount of work you do yourself. And then you suddenly realize that actually life is so much harder when you're not being authentic, but you're not really going with the skills and the interests and the passions and the values that you have. You're hiding something and suppressing it, and that's not good for energy.
Yeah,
it's fun when it happens.
And it's also that you're describing as well, that shift where as you get older, you stop caring as much what other people think of you, and but it's there are always going to be those facets of your personality, or whether it's looks, whether it's how you speak, whether it's your belief in your amount of knowledge compared to the people around you, that you're still going to have these moments where it's going to be like, well, I can't be myself, because if I'm myself, they're going to, as you talked about before, that imposter syndrome, they're going to discover that, I don't know all of the wines, and they're just red or white in my mind. And, it's whatever it is, it's that when you get to the stage where you go, well, that doesn't actually matter. It doesn't really, what other people think of me in and of itself doesn't actually make a blind bit of difference. All that really matters is what impact am I having, and what kind of benefit am I bringing to the world, to myself. And I am straying very close to live, laugh, love territory, but it's I can't, I don't want to go there. But
let's go out and get that tattooed somewhere later on. That's what we need.
It's going to be great on someone else.
Yeah, someone else. Yes, with their consent. How can we tattoo? No, I don't know how that works. But there's one thing definitely I want to acknowledge here is that, if you have been made redundant and you are in that place where at the moment things are not great for you, the opinions of other people, or the perceived opinions of other people will be something that you will be paying attention to. And I can say with absolute certainty now, I worry about that. And 53 years old, do I care less about certain things? Yes. I even own Crocs now, which is like, and I've been to the supermarket in them, and I'm not embarrassed to say that, but there was a point where I never would have done that. And there are still things which I worry about in terms of likability, even with all the work. And sometimes it's not about eliminating or getting rid of those feelings. It's about sticking them in your backpack and carrying them with you, and realizing that, hey, they're not as heavy as you thought you were, and they're a lot smaller, and you can have a smaller backpack. And sometimes, just while you're out traveling and walking, they just start to shut up and don't give you any grief. So it is hard, and I wonder whether as we move through this journey of life that we end up seeing the same things and the same patterns over again. We just see them from a different elevation, and they affect us in different ways.
Brilliant. Dave, this has been absolutely fantastic. I know I've taken a lot of valuable food for thought from it as well. If someone listening wants to work with you or attend your workshop, where's the best place for them to find out more, to reach out to you? What's best?
LinkedIn is always the best place for me, because I'm on LinkedIn every day at the moment. I do need to revisit that because I've done 3.5 years of posting every day, and and I'm going to get bored of it eventually, so I need to do more stuff. So LinkedIn's always a good place. And also by my website, www.davethecoach.co.uk. That's not Dave Coaches, that's Gavin and Stacey. Although somebody did ring me up this week and say, can you help us to get 40 kids down to a school trip? And I went, wrong coaches, mate. It's only the second time in 8 years that's happened. But my website is a great place to get me as well. And you'll find me on various bits of social media as well. So LinkedIn, website, best places.
Brilliant. We'll get the links in the description for the episode as well. And before we close, I ask this question at the end of all my interviews. In your experience of going for interviews, have you got a least favorite interview question to be asked, and why would that be?
The one which always used to make my underwear turn round while I was wearing it is it's what benefit do you think you can bring to this business or organization? And it's always an interesting question, because it requires you to put yourself behind and say, I am here purely for the benefit of the organization. And I think that there's better ways of framing the question, but that one for me was always one which made me feel deeply uncomfortable. Or the other one, which is, do you have any questions? I have many questions, many questions. But I'd say those, that one about what benefit you're going to bring to our organization. It's like, well, you're interviewing me, so you obviously need somebody. And your job description tells you what you want to get out of me. So what are you looking for? Bone marrow for your daughter?
It's a very awkward interview when they lead with that as the answer to this is what we're actually looking for. It's like, oh, okay.
It's when they bring the thing out. I don't know what it's called. It's called a trocar. I'm not sure what it is. Trocar is something in terms of embalming, but
you could tell me it is, and I believe you at this point, because I don't know.
No, but it's that thing where they're like, right, lie on your side, so let's put a little bit of local anaesthetic in, and you might feel a bit of discomfort in the top of your pelvis. It's like, thank you.
It's a very different interview style, for sure. Oh, good stuff. Well, Dave, thank you so much again. Really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome, mate. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it too. It's been great speaking with you.
Right then, back to karaoke. Because here is the thing about karaoke that no one talks about. It's not about whether you can actually sing. Most people, if we're being honest, at a karaoke night can't sing. And I'm not an exception to that. It's not the point, though, and everyone knows it. The point is whether you can commit. Whether you can stand there with a microphone and a screen full of lyrics that you've known since 1997 and just, go for it fully. And the people who are really good at karaoke are almost never the best singers in the room. They're the people who've decided somewhere between the second drink and the song selection that being seen is less frightening than standing at the back watching everyone else have a go. Now, Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer, you know this song, I know this song. There isn't a person alive who came of age in the last 4 decades who doesn't know that song. And I'll tell you for free, for a significant portion of my life, I was absolutely certain the lyric was, "It doesn't make a difference if we're naked or not." Absolutely certain. And I sang it that way at a karaoke night, committed to it fully. It wasn't until only significantly later that I discovered that Tommy and Gina's main concern was making it and not clothing optional arrangements. But the thing I'm trying to get across is I wasn't less committed to my rendition of that song because I had the words wrong. I was fully all in. The wrongness didn't matter because my performance was genuine. Don't get me wrong, I'm not taking requests or fielding off gigs where I'm being asked to come and sing at places. But this is, I think, what Dave is actually talking about. I wanted to pull out 3 things from our conversation that I think are worth considering a bit more. The first one is that confidence is the wrong thing to go looking for. Now, it's worth kind of considering this at a very measured pace because it runs kind of counterproductive to almost everything else you read about when you think about interview preparations and job searching and presenting yourself. The advice is almost always some variation of project confidence, exude confidence, and favourite, fake it till you make it. And Dave's position, and I think he's right, is that confidence is not a starting point, it's a consequence. You don't feel confident and then go and do the thing. You go and do the thing imperfectly, and then your confidence follows on later as a byproduct of having done it. Now, Dave described it as permission, not confidence. And he gives people permission to go and try something, and then they try to do it. And then they realize it wasn't bad as the version in their brain had been running on a loop, over in the middle of the night. And then they do it again, and so on. For anyone in redundancy who's been waiting to feel ready before applying, or waiting to feel confident before going to a networking event, or just waiting until they can articulate their value perfectly before reaching out to anyone, that's the bit I'd push back on. The feeling doesn't come first. The doing comes first, and the feeling wanders in afterwards. The second thing is about speaking from who you are rather than what you know. And Dave mentioned that framework of classical rhetoric, which is emotion, logic, and credibility. And to make a point that I think explains a lot about why so many interview performances feel flat even when the candidate is genuinely excellent, most people lead with ethos. So credentials, experience, results. Here's my track record. Here's what I have achieved. Here's the evidence that I'm a competent person. And I'm not arguing that is fine, that information is necessary, but it doesn't always connect. Because the person sitting across from you, so the hiring manager or the recruiter who's been in back-to-back interviews since 9 o'clock, doesn't always light up at a list of competencies. They light up when they recognize something. When someone says something that makes them think, oh yeah, I know what that feels like, or yes, that's exactly the problem we have, or just understanding that the person that is speaking to them is real. And that recognition comes from story, from the version of your experience that has a person in it, not just an outcome. And the bit that's a bit trickier to sit with, the redundancy itself, the thing you might be most tempted to minimize or explain away, or even present as briefly as possible, is often the most resonant material you have. And it's not because you want people to feel sorry for you, because almost everyone in the room has either been through something similar or knows someone who has. The story connects, the credentials confirm. You need both. But the trap is when you only bring one thing. And the third thing, and this is the one that's been rattling around my head since the chat with Dave, is that your redundancy story is not a liability. And I think that the part that I keep wrestling with is I know that that feels wrong. I know that when you're sat in an interview and someone asks about your current situation, every instinct is to run through the part where you mention redundancy as efficiently as possible and move on to the things that make you look competent. And, competent and together and entirely unbothered by the last however many months. But Dave's point and his own experience backs this up. It's the stories we're most afraid to tell that are almost always the ones that land the hardest when we actually tell them. He mentions standing on stage in 2018 to talk about something he'd been frightened of sharing publicly and nearly not sharing the link afterwards, and then sharing it and getting responses from people who recognize themselves in it completely. And that talk led to his TEDx, which led to selling his practice, which led to where he is now. None of that would have happened if he'd kept the difficult bit quiet. Your redundancy, framed right, is not the thing that disqualifies you. It's the thing that's making you real. The art is going to be in the framing, not hiding the chapter, but knowing which version of it to tell and to whom. And that, as Dave would say, is a skill, which means it's learnable, which means you don't have to wait until you feel ready to start practicing it. So what's the takeaway? I'm going to go back to karaoke one more time. The person who stands up and absolutely belts out Living on a Prayer, wrong words and all, is not going to be the most technically accomplished singer in the room. They're the person who decided that being in the room properly was worth more than watching from the edge of it. And the thing I've been thinking about, nobody in that room cares about the words. They care about the commitment. They care about the fact you showed up to the microphone. And that's my takeaway from this conversation with Dave. Not that you need to be more polished, not that you need to rehearse more answers or project more confidence or somehow transform yourself into the person who finds interviews easy and networking events energizing. My takeaway is simpler and considerably more annoying. You have to go to the microphone. You've got to show up with what you've got and commit to it. The technique, the polish, the confidence, all of that comes afterwards, not before. Dave James has been a fantastic guest to have on the show. I thought the content has been really useful. And if what we've talked about today landed for you, is something shifted, even slightly, or caught yourself nodding a bit, I genuinely encourage you to go and find him. He's on LinkedIn daily, which is more than can be said for most of us. His website is davethecoach.co.uk, and I'll chuck that in the description for the podcast as well. And just to be clear, as he said, that's Dave the Coach, not Dave Coaches, which is, Gavin and Stacey. If you want to book a conversation with him directly, there's a link in the show notes. And if you found today's episode useful, as I've said previously, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It takes seconds. And it just means this ends up in front of more people who are also standing somewhere near the microphone, not quite sure if they're going in. And if you know someone in that position right now, send this over to them. Doesn't need an explanation. Just send it like a karaoke suggestion from someone who knows they know the words really. And if you're asking yourself now what, you're in the right place. Before you go, if any of this has been useful, please do me a favor and follow the show wherever you're listening. And if you've got 60 seconds and an opinion, leave a review. It helps other people find the show, and it also stops me wondering if I'm turning into some sort of audio hermit. And if you want more than just my voice turning up in your ears once a week, head to theinvisibleq.com. It's a support platform for people navigating redundancy, built by people who've actually been through it and remember how strange and exhausting the whole thing is. But for now, thank you for listening. Until next time.